Well, hello and welcome to the New Normal podcast, where we encourage, train, and equip middle and high school students to live for Christ and to share his message of hope with those around them. My name is Ryne, and I am a youth pastor here in the Northern Virginia area. And today I have one of my students with me, Pablo, and we're going to be talking about this idea of being in but not of the world. And so that might be a phrase that you've heard before that's been thrown around in church. Maybe you haven't heard that phrase, and you're like, what is this all about? Well, it's a really cool and interesting topic that I think is always applicable, but especially in today's world, if you're in middle and high school. And so we're going to look into that, talk a little bit more about what that means. And so we're going to dive right in. So stay tuned for today's episode. Now, Pablo, you are in 11th grade.
Correct.
And you're in one of our local high schools, public schools.
Yeah.
And so this idea of being in but not of the world is a daily thing for you, right? Trying to fine tune that and figure out how that works. But before we dive into that, I always love for our students just to have the opportunity to share a little bit about their story, about their faith, and what God has done in their life. And so the way we like to phrase that is, before Christ, when you made a decision to trust Jesus, and how's your life changed since? But I've heard a little bit of your story, and I know that you got saved at a really young age, so we might not remember too much of before Christ.
Yeah.
So why don't you, for the benefit of our audience, why don't you share a little bit about when you trusted Christ, and then how you've grown in your faith since then? What's that looked like, and how has that actually played out in your life personally?
Yeah, so I got saved when I was really young. I was just 4 years old. And, of course, you don't remember, anything before 4. You don't remember anything. So, basically, I've known Christ all my life.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't really until, as I got older where I really started to see Christ really, in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw him, he was, working in me. And it really plays out in my current, today, plays,
Mm-hmm.
my life.
Yeah. So how does that play out day to day? What are some things maybe you've learned, or some big things he's been teaching you lately that have kind of made an impact on you?
One thing that I have actually learned is loving others and treating others with respect, and how Jesus portrayed himself.
Mm-hmm.
I used to be very judgmental. And that was a really big problem until just about a year ago. Christ really got into me, and now I can't even look at anyone with any kind of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
It's just love.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and Jesus says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." And a lot of people take that to be well, then we can't say what's right and wrong. Well, that's not true. God has told us what's right and wrong.
Yeah.
But it goes to that heart of that matter, like you said. When we look on somebody, we should look on them with love, yes. as Jesus said. I mean, the first commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. The second commandment is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. So that's really cool. I appreciate you sharing that. So as we get into this topic today of being in but not of the world, again, it's kind of a church phrase. Sometimes, it's not really something you hear a lot outside of church. So some people might even not know what that is. Some people might have heard it a bunch, but why don't you take your best shot at explaining when we say, hey, in but not of the world, what does that practically look like? What does that mean for a middle or high school student?
I think to understand the question of living in but not of the world,
Mm-hmm.
is that you have to understand that the world is just full of sin, and it's completely ruled by Satan.
Mm-hmm.
And so God wants us to, love him, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But he says you can't love the world and him at the same time.
Yeah.
Because that's basically like saying you love sin, but you love God.
Mm-hmm.
You can't love sin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you say the world is ruled by sin, as a high schooler, how do you see that play out? What does that look like on your daily basis going into a public school, or just living in the world you're living in? What effects of sin do you see? What evidence can you point to that's hey, the world isn't really following what God has for us?
Yeah, I think one of we see this a lot in high school, of course. If you just go to the bathroom, you can obviously see something's going on.
Mm-hmm.
But also not just in high school, but just in modern culture.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at popular artists, rappers or singers,
mm-hmm.
If you just pay attention to their lyrics or even their concerts, you can definitely tell something's not right.
Yeah. And when you say in the bathroom. We know here in our area, there's been a big problem. You're referring to like drugs and vaping and all that stuff. Yeah. And so we know that's a big problem. So yeah, I mean, we all see it, right? Yeah. Like we see that the world isn't exactly got it figured out, got it all together. And I loved what you said about we can't love both the world and God. And Jesus himself tells us that. But I think this idea of being in but not of the world is a really cool topic, and I'm glad you picked it. And you won't find a verse in the Bible that says be in but not of the world. Yeah. You won't find it quoted. But where this idea kind of comes from is John chapter 17 and something called the high priestly prayer. That's what it's commonly referred to as. And all it is it's Jesus, before he's getting ready to go to the cross, Jesus is praying for his disciples. So Jesus is talking to God the Father, and he's praying for his disciples. And so he goes through and literally recaps everything he's done for his disciples. It's really cool, probably my favorite chapter in the Bible. But he says this in John chapter 17, verse 14. He says, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. And so Jesus lays out, look, I am not of the world. God is not of the world. And so anybody who follows me, they're not going to be of the world because they're following something, a way that is different than what the world has, because the world is marred by sin. As you talked about, God has allowed Satan to roam free on the earth. God is ultimately in control, but we know that vast majority of people are not following God's will. So Jesus says, look, we are not of the world. But then he says something interesting in verse 15. He says, I do not ask that you take them out of the world. So Jesus says, look, we're not of the world, but the answer is not to get out of the world, to withdraw from the world. In fact, he says, I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And so Jesus himself says, look, we are not of the world, but God, just as you sent me into the world for a purpose, and Jesus is God, so he agreed with God the Father's plan. Right. But Jesus says, look, I have sent them into the world for a purpose. And so when we look at that idea of, okay, the world is not doing so great. The world is a messed up place, as we all can see. How do we as Christians then do just what Jesus said? How do we engage with that? Like, what does that actually look like? And why is it important for us as Christians to not say, hey, the world is just so messed up, we're just going to kind of hide in the basement and shelter ourselves, and we don't want to mess up, so we're just going to withdraw. How does that practically look like, and why is it so important that we as Christians step in and are willing to be in but not of the world?
I think it's really important that we never keep our faith like to ourselves. It's kind of like the whole point of Christianity. You learn about Christ, and then you go out and preach the word, and then you try to make disciples. And so that's pretty much like the whole point. Jesus came down to earth to
save us. Yeah. He came to preach the word.
Yeah. And so he even asked us to he asked us to just follow him, and then he will make us disciples of men. And so I think one thing that has really like helped me is that, like, even though it may be hard, like talking to people about Christ or like about the gospel, all Jesus says is just to follow him, and then he will make us
fishers of men.
Yep.
Yeah. No. So yeah, this idea that like, practically our faith is not meant to be private. Yeah. And I do think we kind of go the opposite extremes. We have a really unique group in the fact that we have private school kids and homeschool kids and public school kids. And when they get together at youth group, everybody's together, everybody, is growing together, and that's really cool. But I think there's different temptations, right? For the student who is in public school, the world can be really tempting, right? Yeah. For the student who is maybe homeschool or private school, it can be tempting to withdraw and just merely be around Christians all day long. The problem with both of those is, again, in but not of. How can we share our faith if there's nobody around to hear it? And if we're around people sharing our faith, then we need to make sure that our actions match up with that. Yeah. And so I think the best way to kind of explain it is simply this. The threat, the world, is not necessarily external. And here's what I mean, okay? I'm a parent now, right? I've got a son who's 1.
Yeah.
There are things I need to protect him from, right? But ultimately, the biggest thing is I have to protect him from himself. You know what I mean? Like he just, if he were left unsupervised, I mean, he would grab the biggest knife out of the drawer and run around with it and play with the electrical sockets and jump off the couch, right? So when it comes to the Christian life, we have to understand that the real threat is not external. The real threat is internal, because not only is the world marred by sin and broken, we are marred by sin. And so before we trust Jesus, we can't do anything right on our own, right?
Yeah.
But once we trust Jesus, he promises to do a new work in us, but we still have to guard our hearts, right? As Proverbs 4:23 says. And Jeremiah 17:9 says, behold, the heart is deceitful above all things. And so the reason why we need to be in but not of the world, we need to look at it and not say, oh, the threat is all external. We need to look at ourselves and say, hey, I have to guard against my own flesh, my own selfish desires, my own sinful desires. And yeah, this world's going to tempt me, but it makes it kind of reframes the question when I don't see the world as evil and me as good. I see God as good and the world, as fallen and messed up, and I play a role in that sinful nature. And so I have to be careful of myself. But I love what you said about our faith is not meant to be private. Because I think that's kind of something that the world tells us is like, just keep your faith to yourself. And so, but I've kind of found, or maybe I've seen, and I'd love for you to maybe kind of speak into it, and just kind of off the top of your head, like, what does it look like in school right now? Like, what is kind of the reaction when you say you're a Christian, when you do share your faith? What is kind of the reaction you're getting right now? Because I think the fear is like, everybody's going to hate me. Like, nobody's going to want to hear what I have to say. But I think in your conversations with your friends lately who have come to church and trusted Christ, I think you might be seeing a little bit of the opposite, where people do want to hear what you have to say. People are interested in what God is doing, and some people might not be.
Yeah.
But what are you kind of seeing in high school in terms of how are people open to faith, or what are those, are people willing to listen and hear what you have to say?
Yeah, I think now, like, if you bring up like that you're Christian, a lot of times, like, people don't really care.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if they never heard about Christ, they're like, okay, that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a lot of like religion in my school.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's like Muslims, Christians, Jews,
Mm-hmm.
and so like it's not like religion is like no one has ever heard of it.
Yeah.
And so like a lot of times, like normally, like I wear this
Mm-hmm.
cross on my
Yeah.
name, and most of the time people just like they like it,
Mm-hmm.
or like they like, oh, it's a cool chain,
Mm-hmm.
but no one really asks like what does the cross mean?
Yeah. No, I think that's perfect what you said, because essentially what people kind of identify now is they say, I'm spiritual but not religious, right?
Yeah.
So most kids who are Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu, some of them take their faith very seriously, but you go to a pretty diverse school, and I would say most of them, it's kind of just their family, what they do, and they identify with it, but they don't really live it out as much. And so, 40% of your generation actually identifies as religious none, meaning they don't have any spiritual or religious affiliation, but they're open to faith conversations. I think that's cool and really cool that, that's kind of what you're seeing on the ground, where it's not enough to just say I'm a Christian, right? Like you have to actually be like, hey, what do you believe? What do you believe? And it's a great conversation starter, because we know that being a Christian, quote, Christian, isn't what saves you. Going to church isn't what saves you. The only thing that saves you is, placing your faith in what Jesus has done for you. He paid the penalty we couldn't pay. And saying, God, I give my life to you. I'm not in control. You are.
Yeah.
And so just saying I'm a Christian or things like that. So there's great conversation starters.
Yeah.
But that's really the only thing that matters at the end of the day, is sharing that message. And that's what we're so passionate about. So, all right. So we know we should be in, but not of the world. We've kind of talked a little bit about what that looks like, but what are some practical safeguards we should put in place? Like, how do we make sure that as we are sent into the world, like Jesus said in John 17, how do we make sure we don't end up looking like the world? How do we balance that? What are some practical safeguards we can put in place to help us with that?
I think the best way to really like, stay out of like the world, but of course stay in,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think the best way is just to read his word,
Mm.
because if you get familiar with this word, what is sin, and you know what like he's against,
Mm-hmm.
and then you know where like what to stay away from. So
Mm.
like, drugs or sex
Mm-hmm.
outside of marriage, of course.
Yep.
And all of these things, you just got to like be familiar with it. And
Yeah. And those are some of the obvious ones, right? Some people might even be like, I even know that's wrong. What are some sins maybe that the Bible might reveal to us? It's like, hey, this isn't okay either, even though that might be something we do a lot and we don't really consider it that bad.
I think probably the most one is just swearing.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of people swear and they don't really know like God says it's not okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, read his word so that we can understand. How has being in Christian community helped you with that too? Like being at church, being in youth group, how has that helped you kind of maybe be in but not of the world? What does that look like for you? Why is it so important for you to be involved in some sort of Christian community?
I think it's really important because we come to youth group and like you teach,
Mm-hmm.
you give us a lesson, and then we of course we take in that information,
Mm-hmm.
and we refresh our minds.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like it's really important to come here.
Yeah. Well, and so you actually have the benefit too of a lot of the kids who come to youth group go to your high school.
Yeah.
So what does that look like when you're walking down the hall, maybe doing something you maybe shouldn't be or something, as we've all done, and
Yeah.
you see somebody else from youth group? Like, how does that maybe kind of help you be like, oh, like maybe I should rethink that?
I don't know.
You go to a big school, so maybe.
Yeah.
But that idea of accountability, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, like that idea of being a part of a group allows us for, as it says, in the Bible, it says two are better than one, right? Because
Yeah.
they can pick each other up. A threefold cord is not easily broken. So, I think one of the biggest safeguards is having accountability, having a group that you're accountable to. Being a part of a group where if we are straying, if we are doing something we shouldn't be, or if we are starting to look more and more like the world, that we have somebody else who can say, hey, like, that's not what God wants for us. Like, he has something better for us. Like, let's redirect. Let's come over here, or let's put safeguards in place. I think that's one of the biggest things. The other thing I think is just simply understanding our mission, right? We are not here just to avoid sin. Like, we should avoid sin, right?
Yeah, of course.
But that's not the main goal of the Christian life. Now, if we truly love God, then we will, hey, we're not going to give into temptation. We're going to resolve. We're going to follow Jesus. But if I stand before God one day and I'm like, man, Jesus, like, I went to church every Sunday and I read my Bible every Sunday, and I had a lot of Christian friends, God's going to be like, that's great, but did you make disciples? And so when we understand our true mission is to be in but not of the world, I forget what missionary said it, but he said this. He said, some wish to live within the sound of chapel bells. I wish to run a rescue mission within a yard of hell. This idea that like the world is lost. The world doesn't, the world is headed to its own destruction. And we were all headed to our own destruction, but Jesus, but God. And so making sure that we're going into the world to share that very message of hope and faith, and saying, hey, look, God has something better for you. Look over here. Here's the real truth. And so I think that's one of the biggest safeguards, is having accountability, somebody who will help guide you, not only peers, but mentors, adults, parents, but also too, just remembering why we're here, because then it kind of reframes why we should be in the world, but not of the world. Yeah. So, man, I appreciate you taking time today. Any lasting advice, maybe on this topic, maybe just in general, somebody who's watching, who's made it this far, if you could leave one piece of wisdom, one piece of advice, one thing that God has taught you, what would you say to them?
I think, like if any of you are, battling with any like anxiety or depression, I think the best way really is just to give it all to God.
Mm.
And if you just pray and just ask him to take the wheel, and, just allow him to get into you and get into your life. I think he will work in you, and he will work it out.
Yeah. Amen, man. Well, that's all we have for today. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's episode. Pablo, thank you for your willingness to share and come on and talk about what God's doing in your life. We're so thankful that you've chosen to watch this. And if it was a benefit to you, we just ask that you share, like, subscribe, just continue to encourage, train, and equip others. And so we're so thankful for what God is doing in this next generation. We know that he has put all of us here for such a time as this. And so we're excited to see what God continues to do as we take that message of hope to those who need to hear it. So thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see y'all next time.